We slept all the way until at least around 11 the next morning. And since I was planning to serve the Swedish Army's famous yellow pea soup with pork and pancakes for lunch, even though it wasn't a Thursday, I had to get started right away. It needs to simmer for several hours to turn out really good. I skinned and deboned a cured pork hock that was going to boil with the soup for a while, bones and all. It was a very cold, yet an absolutely wonderful day out in the forest, and we had no schedule to keep, so we let the day unfold entirely at our own pace. We puttered around, tidied up, and took care of last night's dishes, and so on. We thought we spotted fresh moose tracks right outside the tent. Tracks we couldn't remember seeing the night before. But to be fair, it had been very dark when we arrived, so we weren't completely sure.
Jag har frusit fast.
Ja.
Små strimmor.
Ja, jävligt coolt faktiskt.
Ja, fan.
Nu tänkte jag.
After about half an hour, I took the bones and the large chunks of meat out of the soup, so I could dice the meat into smaller pieces.
Jag ska skära de här och liksom stycka upp till små bitar. Eller hur? Man vill ha ganska små fläskbitar, va?
Ja, det är väl så det brukar vara.
Ja. Tärna upp liksom.
Ja.
The bones we tossed out into the forest for the birds to pick at, while the diced meat went back into the soup.
Löken ska tydligen vara som så att den liksom ska försvinna. Ja. Man tar i en hel lök med 2 stycken kryddnejlikor instuckna i. När ska man ta upp löken?
Nej, det gör man
inte ta upp löken, den försvinner.
Den ska mosas liksom. Det betyder ju dock att den här ska koka jävla tag.
2,5 timme.
Okej.
We realized we actually hadn't eaten any breakfast yet, so John boiled coffee on the jet stove. Then we moved the soup pot over to it, making room for the griddle on the fire pit, so we could fry tomatoes, sausage, black pudding and bacon for breakfast. Or perhaps we should call it brunch, since it was already somewhere between 1 and 2 in the afternoon by then. It didn't matter. None of us was paying much attention to the time anyway.
Som toast. En vinnares frukost. Klockan 1:30. Ja. På dagen.
We took it easy and enjoyed our coffee in peace before straightening up a bit inside the tent, making sure the evening's wine was already placed on the table near the stove so it wouldn't get too cold. Again. The tent is large and spacious, roughly 5 meters in diameter, So there's plenty of room for 3 camp beds along the walls and a table for 4 between the center pole and the innermost bed. On either side of the door we usually place the wooden crates we use to transport the stoves and chimney pipes. And they work well as sturdy surfaces for water containers, heavy things or anything else that needs to stand securely out of the way. In the afternoon we were expecting a lunch guest. It was Joppis who wanted to come by and see how we were doing out in the forest. Believe it or not, he'd been out playing disc golf all morning, in this cold. But he didn't want to miss the chance to have pea soup and pancakes out in the forest. For anyone who's done military service in Sweden, that's nostalgia of the highest order. Since we had completely lost track of time, lunch was delayed quite a bit, by normal standards. But Joppis didn't mind waiting. We sat down to catch up, shoot the breeze and enjoy life, while the soup kept simmering over the fire.
Ja, vi kunde ju inte ha våran varmvattenberedare för att det där hade ju frusit i pumpen. Sen fick vi inte på den i alla fall, eller jag fick inte.
I had prepared the pancake batter in advance, but I hadn't been nearly as careful about making sure I had the right equipment. I had a camping frying pan that was the same size as a classic Swedish pancake pan and with equally low sides, so I assumed it would work fine. But that turned out to be a miscalculation. As they say, assumption is the mother of all F-ups. It turned out to have a foldable handle, and on top of that I couldn't find a proper spatula flexible enough for pancake duty. Well, I had to experiment with the gear we had, and eventually I managed to produce a batch of pancakes that were somewhat acceptable. But they were maybe the worst pancakes I've ever made. And as a loyal subject of the Swedish king, I am deeply ashamed. Anyway, around 4 in the afternoon, with the sun already on its way down, lunch was finally served. We chose to eat inside the tent for practical reasons. So of course, the camera fogged up again, as you can see. The classic way to eat pea soup and pancakes is to drink warm Swedish punch with it. We had brought a special little copper kettle for that purpose. It sits on a small stand with a tea light underneath to keep the drink warm, and it has a tiny hole in the lid for the handle of the little ladle, so it can stay in place even with the lid on. As I said, they weren't my best looking pancakes, but they tasted all right.
Hoppas att det dugert.
As you can see, there's plenty of room for 4 people at the dining table despite the camp beds. But it does require a somewhat clever bit of organizing inside the tent, especially in the winter when you have so much more stuff. It turns into chaos very quickly if you don't think things through. Since the tent has such a high ceiling with full standing height everywhere except right along the walls, it feels spacious, airy and comfortable even with a table in the middle. After lunch, Joppis thanked us, said his goodbyes and headed home. By then the sun had already set and it was pitch black outside when Freddan immediately began preparing dinner for the evening. On the menu for the evening was wild boar ragu that ideally should simmer for 5 or 6 hours for all the flavors to really come into their own.
Ja, ytterst marginellt möjligen. Men jag tror det handlade om att den svalnade så snabbt.
The wild boar came from the local hunting team and had actually been taken within a few hundred meters or possibly a kilometer or so from our current campsite. You can't get more locally sourced meat than that.
säkert för att kissa, men
Ja.
att det inte registrerat än.
Nej. Ja, precis. Och de hinner gå in igen innan
The meat had already been ground, which Joppis would probably have considered borderline semi-processed if he'd still been there. If you've seen our previous video from our November camping trip, you'll understand why. And by the way, I can highly recommend it if you enjoy this kind of videos. All our videos, in fact, because, well, this is what we do. We head out into the forest, make ourselves as comfortable as we possibly can, and cook the best food we were capable of during these circumstances. Simply enjoying life. This isn't about survival. It's about truly living.
Det är klarare idag, apropå svart mellan stjärnorna. Svartare. Oj, den här var stenjävla.
While the wild boar ragout simmered away in the pan outside, we took the opportunity to sit down inside and enjoy a glass of wine in the warmth. And believe it or not, for the first time ever, regardless of season, we opened a perfectly tempered bottle of wine while camping. You can imagine the steep learning curve that implies. Throughout the day, the temperature had been dropping, from very cold to very cold. So a large part of our work during these days was constantly chopping firewood into pieces small enough to fit either the jet stove or the cast iron tent stove. We had brought 10 sacks of prime birch firewood, 40 liters each, so in total we went through 400 liters of firewood during these days. We also managed to capture the exact moment on camera when the water reached freezing point in the pot and crystallized. This is what that looks like.
Ser det? En liten kant kvar på.
And since it was so cold, we figured we might as well take advantage of it. So Freddan had planned for us to make ice cream for dessert later that evening. He scraped out a fresh vanilla pod with a knife and mixed it with generous amounts of powdered sugar in a metal bowl. Not that I think it was necessary in this temperature, but to help transfer the cold from the snow to the cream, he salted the snow before sinking the bowl into it. Then it was just a matter of pouring in the cream and stirring with a rubber spatula until it thickened, while the pasta water was coming to a boil on the jet stove. This particular bowl happened to have a rubber coating on the bottom on the outside, an anti-slip grip for kitchen counters. So actually no temperature transferred through the bottom at all, as it turned out. But it was so cold that it only took a couple of minutes anyway. Along the edges, where there were no rubber coating, the cream froze almost instantly. And before we knew it, it had turned into vanilla ice cream. We just set it aside to wait for the dinner to be ready.
Ja, där har vi glass.
While waiting for the pasta, we each had a gallop beer. Well, that's a small beer served in a wine glass, meant to be drunk quickly before you gallop on to the next establishment.
Nej, Kalle, det var Kalle.
Det var kall öl.
Det var Kalle.
Ja, en liten kall.
Ja, det var lite Kalle.
A cold beer takes on a whole new meaning when it's minus 22 degrees Celsius and the beverage freezes in the glass as you drink it. It felt wonderful to go inside and sit down in the tent, when the linguine had finally cooked to a perfect tenderness, with just the slightest bite in the center.
Där var den.
Ja.
Alltså jag märker nu vilken jävla bra kängor jag har.
We mixed a small portion of the ragu directly into the pasta and stirred it in the pot to glaze the linguine before serving. And then everyone could add more ragu on their plates and top it with parmesan to taste.
Ja, det blev fan bra.
According to the timestamp on the video files, it was already 22:55 when we sat down to eat. And believe me, it was worth every minute of the 5 hours it took to make the meal. It was absolutely fantastic. We enjoyed the well-chosen wine to the fullest, and it was perfectly tempered, by the way. But John wanted a bit more Swedish punch, since the double-digit Sub-Zero Gallop beer had left him a little chilled on the inside. That led us to speculate about what the drink is called in English. You already know it since we mentioned it before in this video, but we didn't at the time. So for the first time on this trip, Freddan actually pulled out his phone so we could Google it.
Ibland ser är Arac punch eller caloric punch. Men den allra vanligaste i engelskspråkiga sammanhang är det helt enkelt Swedish punch.
Now we all know.
Vad gott det där ser ut.
Once our thirst for knowledge was satisfied, it was time for dessert. Our homemade, or rather forest-made, vanilla ice cream.
Det smakar fan glass alltså.
Om man inte får väck på ryggen av det här, då får man inte väck på ryggen.
By the time we finished dessert, it was way after midnight and we felt it was time to crawl into bed after a long day. The fire went out twice during the night, but I had positioned myself so I could refill the stove without having to crawl out of my sleeping bag. That was probably a good thing because it was very cold even inside the tent.